Today's discussion just is going to be about letters of recommendation, just so you guys can better understand how to get a really strong letter of recommendation and to how to basically go about asking for one, requesting for one. What does a strong letter of recommendation look like? Everything and anything really basically related to letters of recommendation. Before we really begin about how to go about requesting one, what you should do, what you should say, everything else, I think it's first and foremost really important for you guys to understand why do we need recommendation letters. Because if you understand the objective behind a recommendation letter, although it might seem straightforward, I think it will help you guys to request and also craft a really strong recommendation letter with the individual who is going to be writing it for you. So I just try to keep it really simple. Basically, three different kind of words that I think really perfectly describe what basically recommendation letters are all about. So I like to just describe it with three words, as you guys can see, which is character, testimony, and endorsement, or the kind of abbreviation would be CTE. And so for character, what that really means is just that a recommendation letter is supposed to discuss who you are outside of academia a lot of times, or who you are inside of academia. But a lot of times a recommendation letter is supposed to be a supplemental item in addition to your application to give the application or the admissions team greater insight into who you are as an individual. And so they want to know who you are outside of academia and that you're not just some kind of academic robot who's always performing really well on tests, doing everything they're supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. The second word, testimony, is it's basically providing a personal testimony to your abilities and to what you're able to do. And so this testimony is really important because it gives an objective perspective on what abilities you have, what you have achieved, how you tackle challenges, the list goes on. And so a testimony is really important because it gives us the ability to understand, okay, well, this student would describe themselves as XYZ, but would somebody else who is not the student also say the exact same thing or something different? And so it gives them the opportunity to maybe add in additional items, additional characteristics about you that are also positive, or also reconfirm those things that you have already listed. So kind of those two approaches. And lastly, I think endorsement. They're basically endorsing your application and they are supporting it. And what that means is just that they're saying that me as a qualified individual in whatever field, whether they're a professor, community leader, internship supervisor, you name it, they, in their current position and status, and having already evaluated you, they are willing to support your application and they think that you would make a great applicant or a great student or candidate for whatever program it is you're applying for. And so that's really important because the recommendation letter shows that this qualified individual says, yes, I think this student is a great choice for your program and here's why. So just some things to take into account when why do we need recommendation letter? Who should write my recommendation letter? I think this is a really important kind of slide to start off with because there are so many different people and individuals who can write your recommendation letter outside of the very standard and typical professor who's probably going to write a recommendation letter for you. I don't know how your applications look right now. A lot of times applications allow you to include just one letter, sometimes two. I think three is already getting to be a little bit too much, but maybe that's what they require as well. But I think two is oftentimes a standard number because it gives you the opportunity to include one academic letter and one non-academic letter. And so taking that into account that there are multiple types of letters that can be written, there are also very many different individuals who can write those letters. So as you guys can see, the first one I put was a past or current professor. Obviously, a current professor makes so much sense because you currently have them, they know you and who you are right now as a person because you change over time as a student, but they know you in present time and so they can speak to your abilities best because they know who you are right now. The past professor is equally as strong though because they can maybe see a progression in what you've done, etc. Something to note though with a past professor, you can only go back so far. So obviously they don't want to hear from your first grade professor about how awesome your doodle drawings were, how good you were at very basic mathematics. This can probably go back to maybe 2-3 years, I would say. In the US, our high school lasts 4 years. So that means from ninth grade until 12th grade. So I'll leave it up to you guys to kind of recalculate for your years. But I think the best ones to choose from, even if it's going to be a past professor, would be 2 years max. I think just because in the past year or two, you've probably had your more advanced or upper level courses. They can speak to your abilities best in the more advanced areas. So second is a job or internship supervisor. Again, this is somebody who is in a role where they are evaluating you. They're evaluating your performance. They are seeing what kind of person you are, how you tackle challenges, how you respond to feedback, how receptive you are to feedback, and how do you apply that feedback or criticism in a different situation, so lots of different things that a job or internship supervisor does. And I think these first two are probably the first two kinds of recommendation letters that people probably think about most. But these last three are a bit more of the creative ones, slash those non-academic ones, even though the job and internship supervisor is also non-academic. But these last three, I think, are a little bit more of these non-traditional ones, but they are equally as effective, and you should utilize them because they could be potentially to your advantage. So as I said, as you guys can see as well, a community leader. A community leader is a great person to ask to write your recommendation letter. A community leader can really look like anything. They can be a religious community leader, so maybe it's a pastor from your local church, an individual who, like a community leader or youth group leader in your local mosque, synagogue, Buddhist temple, it doesn't matter what religion, just somebody who's maybe in a mentor role for you, supervisor, somebody you've worked with for some little group inside your religious community, you name it, Sports as well. Sports is great because you're always being evaluated by a coach or an instructor, trainer. They see your performance constantly. They also are evaluating you, giving you feedback. And so I think you guys are hopefully starting to understand that a recommendation letter is normally from somebody who is in a position to evaluate you in some kind of way or capacity. And so that's really important because if they haven't been able to evaluate you really in any way, then how can they really speak to your abilities because they haven't taken the time to really look at them? So just something to think about. Mentor or a counselor, again, so the community leader kind of can be like a mentor role, but a counselor, I think a counselor is a great option because a counselor a lot of times is an academic letter, but also they know a lot of the non-academic sides to you. And I say that because I don't know how counselors work in Kazakhstan, but in the US, a counselor normally is someone we talk to about anything and everything. So if I'm having a personal problem, I have some personal challenge, I have a success that I want to discuss, I have some options, and I want to see what's best for me. My counselor would probably know a lot about me, not just in an academic setting. And so they can write a very strong letter, essentially, because they have a comprehensive understanding of what kind of student I am. Lastly, I think the last type of recommendation letter I could think of as to who could write one, I thought probably program head or school administrator. Now, I should probably have added an asterisk, a little like star next to this one, because this could be a dangerous trap. And some of these actually could be dangerous traps, as you'll see with this little tip that I put here. Your school administrator, although their title probably seems really big and it's great, unless you've really worked with them and they really do know some of the things you've done, it might not necessarily be beneficial for you just to have the school administrator write you a recommendation letter, just because you think that, oh, well, this is the director of my school. It's like the number one person to ask for a letter. And I say this from my own experience because I think there have been maybe a couple of times where I almost fell into this trap, and maybe once or twice where I actually did probably fall into it. And so what I'm really trying to say, and the tip that you guys can see, is that while the position or rank of an individual can be important to some extent, ultimately you guys need to select and choose somebody who knows you well. And I say this because if you choose, for example, in this case, the director, they might know you from a few interactions, but they don't really know you. They don't have a lot of substance to add to your application through a letter because they're going to write a very generic letter that just really gives blanket statements that aren't really unique. They're not specific to you. I could add those exact same statements to any other applicant and it would fit, And you want a letter that is unique, it is detailed, and it adds to your narrative of who you are. And so that's the dangerous trap that you can fall into is you choose somebody who you think, wow, well, their title sounds so awesome. They're like the president, like If you chose the president of Kazakhstan to write your letter, you would think on paper, wow, well, it's the president of Kazakhstan or president of US or whoever. They have such a big title, but they might not know you at all. So what kind of justice or benefit does that do to your application if they just write, this student is a strong student. I think they have good work ethic and they try a lot and they put forth a lot of effort. Okay, great. But what does that really tell me about this student? What concrete examples have they given me? So you should choose someone who knows you well, whether that's professor, current or past, job or internship supervisor, community leader, whatever. But that's up to you to decide. And so you have to know, does somebody actually know me well or not? And hopefully when you do ask them to write your letter, you'll sit down and discuss with them these things. And you'll see if somebody really knows you well or not. So what should be in a recommendation letter? I tried to just keep them really brief and succinct, kind of short, so you guys understand what should be in a recommendation letter. I'm telling you what should be in one, not because you're going to necessarily be writing one and turning it in yourself, because you're not. Obviously, someone else is writing it for you, but you're going to hopefully be meeting with the person or discussing with the person who's going to write your recommendation letter. And you guys are going to talk about a few things that maybe should be included, what things that you would like to be highlighted. You're not going to completely dictate what the letter is going to be like, but again, you are their biggest resource, and so you're going to help them along the way. And by doing that, you're going to remind them of things because let's face it, professors, for example, they have to teach loads of students, so they might not necessarily remember every individual thing you've done. Although they know you really well as an individual and they are happy to write you a letter, they might not remember the first project you did for them and you received maybe an A plus. They might not remember that project. And so it's okay, they're human, you have to remind them. And so that's why it's important for you to understand what should be in a recommendation letter so that you know, okay, yeah, these are the types of things I should be discussing with the individual to help them have more things to write about, for them to have more concrete examples to include, to make it as strong of the letter as possible. And so those concrete examples slash anecdotes, which is the first line, anecdotes are really just stories, a lot of showing and not telling. And so that's really important. And that's something I cannot stress enough is, as in the example when I used with the director of the school, a director can simply tell, oh yeah, this student is amazing, but they might not be able to show that you're amazing because they don't have personal examples and interactions with you that they can include in the letter. And those anecdotes, which are those little mini stories of saying, well, instead of just saying, oh, this student has a strong work ethic, I can instead talk about the time how I assigned you a project and you devoted a lot of time before and after class coming to meet with me to get feedback on your project throughout the entire process. And I saw that you dedicated a lot of time and that this demonstrated great work ethic. You need to show and not tell. And a lot of your recommendation writers will know this, but you need to help them by giving them those little bits of information that help them create that story, give those examples. The second point, achievements, whether those are achievements with the individual themselves. So maybe you did something in class and you got like the top score. That's an achievement. And if they want to highlight that, great. Sometimes you also have to remind them that, oh yeah, I got the top score, because they might not necessarily remember all those little details. Projects and assignments. This is also a great one because these are specific things that they've assigned you and that were able to evaluate you on. And so that this evaluation is important because then it's their opportunity to bring in their conclusions. What did they conclude at the end of this assignment that they gave you? Did they conclude that you were a good student, bad student? What kind of student were you, etc.? Or what kind of individual were you if it's not a professor? They don't all have to be academic evaluations. In your internship or your job or whatever, if you're working in a retail, like clothing company, and your supervisor gave you the task of setting up a new display, how did you go about setting up that display? Did you have a creative approach? Were you innovative in your thinking? There's so many ways you can do these. So don't concentrate on just one formula because these things can go any way. And so be creative with how you approach your recommendation letter because they should ultimately, again, give that supplemental information to your application. Challenges, just like projects, are a great way to talk about your abilities. Transcript notations, what I mean by transcript notations are basically if you took a professor, and so transcript notations, just to note, is more about academic letters than non-academic letters because these are going to be your grades. Let's say you're applying to a biology program at XYZ University, and you want your biology professor from school to write you a letter. They can notate because not notate, but what they can do is they can just bring or further emphasize whatever grade it was that you got in their biology course. And so, although the admissions team might have that grade already, you can have that recommender basically bring greater attention to that grade and say, look, well, this person got an A++ in my class, and I'm a specialist in this field. And so they succeeded really well. And I just want to bring this to your attention because if they've succeeded now, this is a good sign that they most likely will succeed in your program, in your biology program at XYZ University, you know. So those are types of things you can think about as well. They can use your grades as also evidence to justify what it is that they're saying. And lastly, all of those things, those first 5 points, should result in what we call a detailed characterization of you. So again, it is telling us who you are in as much detail as possible, being specific to provide that supplementary description and highlighting curated items and traits. And as you guys can see from the tip, the word curated really just means strategically selected items and traits. Again, you want to be strategic. You need to have a strategy. And that strategy is oftentimes having a plan. And to have a plan, you have to discuss with the person who's going to write your recommendation letter. What do you want to include? What do you not want to include? What should they maybe talk about? Should it be something that's already in your application? Or maybe it's something that you weren't able to include that you want them to include. So that's something just to think about. But yeah, so think about strategy, being strategic, and everything else. So when do you request your recommendation letter to ensure that you're going to have a strong recommendation letter? And I think this is the obvious answer. I don't think this comes as a shock to anybody, but the sooner the better. You want to be very prompt in making the request and also following up with all the necessary information and taking the time to setting up a meeting to discuss the letter with them, discuss your program, discuss your motivations, etc. The reason for this is because the more time you give them, the more time they are able to look at everything that you've provided them, for them to think about you as a student, and then for them to put all of that onto paper. And that doesn't really take a day. You know, they say like Rome wasn't built in a day. And hopefully recommendation letters also don't take a day, you know. The strongest recommendation letters probably take a little bit of time, and that's a good thing. The fact that they take a bit of time shouldn't scare you. It should put you at ease because it means that this individual is taking the time to really include examples, really think about how to put you in the best light possible. And that's something that's really good because then it can really showcase your strengths, your abilities as best as possible in the most effective, strategic way possible. So as you guys can see, the tip is just the more time someone has to write, the more likely the letter will be well thought out and detailed. And that detail is the important part because you can't include a bunch of detail if you really hurry and rush a letter because there's so many minor things that I might forget about or leave out. And the best way for you to ensure that your recommendation letter writer doesn't just rush through the process is by letting them know in advance. So it's not telling them a week before the deadline, it's letting them know maybe 2-3 months before the deadline. Even though that seems early to you, that's a standard amount of time, probably, I would say, for them. So how should I request a recommendation letter? So from my personal experience, I've included 3 ways that I've done it before. And I just kind of put in a little bit of, or not discussion, but a description of each one and which one I think is the most effective, what are the benefits of each one. So obviously the first form that you can use is email. It's convenient. It takes into account the individual schedule, meaning that they don't have to get back to you immediately. They can respond the next day, maybe a few days later. So it's an easy way for you to avoid maybe that having to go chase them down and make sure you find the right time. You don't have to set up a meeting, you know, in an email right away. You just kind of knock everything out. And requesting and having that discussion, like I said, because you want to discuss with your recommendation letter writer, all of the items and everything else, doing all of that in email, there's nothing wrong with that. Especially right now, I think in light of the current situation, the same thing with telephone is that a lot of things are going to be a little bit more from a distance. And so doing so in an email there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes that's the only way you can do it, and that is okay. My second approach, which I would say that I try to use the most often, is in person. In person because it's genuine. It shows that if you're able to go do it in person, you probably know the person really well, and that's a good sign. And also, it is a great way for you to really sit down already and discuss with them. And it demonstrates that you're a little bit more professional. You're willing to meet them in person, to sit down and discuss it, go through everything, rather than just send a quick email. Again, an email isn't bad, but I think an in-person method is a little bit better, and it is the preferred approach because it can result in greater detail. And as I've said, and as you guys have probably noticed, greater detail results in a stronger letter. Lastly, telephone. Again, if you want to still have that in-person interaction, but you have to keep at a distance, I think the perfect blend of the first two is calling them. If you have their number, they might answer, they might not. Maybe shoot them a text and say, hey, can I set up a time to call you or whatnot. So again, those are the three methods that I could think of. If you guys have a question of some other way, I don't think you should really worry about how you reach out to them necessarily, because this is just kind of one small step in the grand scheme of the letter. This is just to ensure that you get the letter. But again, the tip, and I hope these tips are helping because these are really the key takeaways of each slide, is the more time you have to discuss the letter with the individual, obviously, the better an endorsement the letter will be, as it includes as much information as possible.
How should I help an individual write a recommendation letter? Um, Again, like I said, you are the recommendation writer's biggest resource. You are they're writing about you, and also who knows you better than you know? While they might know you well, you know yourself the best, and you have all the information about yourself that anyone can possibly have. And so to help them, you need to provide as much information as possible to ensure that the letter is as strong as possible. And so what kind of information do you need to include slash provide to make sure that they are able to write a really strong letter? The first one, which is probably obvious, is your transcripts. So all the grades you've received and essays that you might submit. So for those who were in my previous workshop last week, we talked about some other supplemental items that are often optional in a application. And some of those optional items include essays, a personal statement, motivation letter, etc. And so if you're going to write those, you should also include them and provide them to the person who's going to write your letter, because it gives them more of an understanding and more information to include in their letter. And so they can help really confirm the information you've put, reaffirm, etc. Two, provide a copy of your application itself, if that is possible. Sometimes you can just print it out, and I think that's good because then they can see what kind of program you're applying to, what other like items you've already included in your application, what things have you highlighted that maybe they won't highlight because you've already dedicated a lot of time to it, so they will focus on other aspects, or maybe they will re-highlight those things, you name it. But if you can provide them a copy of the application, that is also really good. The third item is discuss your motivations for the specific program and university. This lets them also tailor and kind of craft their letter to your specific needs. Because if they know why you want to do this specific program, so why you want to major in skydiving at XYZ University, let them know why, because then they can be more effective in understanding your motivations and they can make that clear in the letter as well. And so that then the admissions team really understands your motivation and why you want this specific school for this specific program. And lastly, inform the individual of all recognitions and achievements. So to do that, a lot of times you just provide a resume. Give them a copy of your resume, and that is sufficient in giving them more material to work with. Now, again, as I highlighted earlier, sometimes there are a few traps to not fall into. And the issue is with providing a resume is that sometimes you can get a recommendation letter writer who just basically recites your resume. And while that's good that they talk about all your recognitions and achievements, they haven't really talked about their personal interaction with you and examples of what that showed them and how they were able to then understand who you are as a person through those interactions. Because if they just focus on all your recognitions and achievements, that's also not necessarily good. So that's something you should discuss with them, is what kind of examples maybe you want to include in addition to some recognitions they might highlight in the letter. But it shouldn't only be a copy, basically another way of presenting your resume in the format of a letter. That's not really good, and it does the admissions team no help because they might already have a copy of your resume, and so they're basically reading the same thing twice, just in a different kind of format, and that might annoy them actually. So I recommend that you help your letter writer by providing them as much information so that they don't have to just basically repeat information on your resume, but they have a lot of different information that they can use to weave into the letter. So that tip, again, I think this is probably one of the most important things is you are the letter writer's biggest resource. And I can't stress that enough. You are, no one else, just you and the letter writer. Lastly, additional pieces of advice that I think that are good and from my own experience, I just included four. But the first one was try writing your own letter. And this is important for two reasons. One, if you write your own letter, you can see what kind of things you maybe want to include and what kind of things not to include. And this helps because then you better understand what the letter should probably look like, what achievements you want to include, what examples, and you can then provide it to the person who's going to write it as maybe a draft copy. It gives them an idea of, okay, yeah, I should maybe include these examples, so that then you're not necessarily dictating what the person is writing, because in the end they choose what they're going to include, but you are giving them kind of in a very strategic and hopefully non-aggressive slash forceful way of, here you go, here's a copy of what I kind of would like you to include. Obviously you have the final decision, but here are some things for you to think about. Two, the reason I say write your own letter of recommendation is because don't be surprised if someone says, can you write the letter, and I will review it and edit it and where I need, and then I will submit it for you. I have had this happen once or twice, and that is not a bad thing. I used to, when I had that happen to me the first time, I was worried because I thought it was maybe something wrong, like bad, that, oh no, they don't want to write the letter for me and they just want me to write it because they don't know what to write. But sometimes your letter writers are busy, and that's okay. And so you can help them. Like I said, you're the biggest resource. And so if you do the first draft for them, it is 10,000 times easier for them to then go in and edit it and add in examples or fix it how they need, because they already have that base to start with. Two, take initiative to develop a close relationship with a select few individuals who can endorse you. It's like I said, you have to think about this as strategy. So if you guys still have time to develop those relationships, or if you already have, great. But for those who haven't maybe developed or taken the time to develop those relationships, don't feel like you need 1,000 people to write letters for you. You only need probably 2 or 3 really strong people. And you oftentimes only have to choose one of those individuals out of those 2 or 3. But it's good to have a few different individuals so you're not having the same person write all your letters. And that's for a variety of reasons. A, maybe the person will get a little bit annoyed, even though they don't say it, but they don't necessarily want to have to be the only person writing all of your letters, no matter how much they love you. Give them a break. Two, if you only have one person to write you a letter and the application requires 2 letters, then you're in a predicament because you don't have someone else. So it's good to just take the time to really get to know a few people. Don't stress yourself out by getting to know 10 people. That's too many. Focus on getting to know a few of your professors, your community leaders, those people in that list that I previously provided. And I think that'll be a big benefit for you all. 3, decide what parts of the application you would like to have highlighted. Again, this comes back to strategy and having a plan. If you let the the writer know what they need to include and what should be highlighted, you're making their job easier. And also it's resulting in a stronger, more effective letter, because you already know and you're setting the stage by saying, okay, I want you to include XYZ because I didn't include it in my application and I would like for it to be included. So your letter is the perfect opportunity for me to include it. So if you could highlight it, I would appreciate it. And they will let you know, but oftentimes they listen to you because they want to be your resource too and help you. Lastly, use the letter to include any information, like I just said, that cannot be included on the application itself. While a letter can also reaffirm, it can equally also include information that hasn't been sent before. So just some pieces of advice for you all to think about when you're going through this process. That really concludes the presentation itself, but I'm a firm believer in kind of also using tangible examples and giving you guys a little mini exercise because it gives you the opportunity to kind of put into practice, hopefully, some of the bits of information that I've included in this presentation. What we're going to do is I just included three really short examples of what a recommendation letter could look like to help you kind of think about what does a strong letter look like, you know, because if you don't know what a strong letter looks like, then how are you going to be able to judge A, if the person has wrote you a strong letter, and B, how can you help them write that strong letter if you don't know what it looks like? Are there any keywords on which the admission committee is looking definitely for? That's a good question. And I would say not necessarily, but if you're applying to a specific program, maybe here's a tip, because the same goes for a job, just by the way, when you're applying. Whenever they have a description of like, for example, what the job is, what the program is, what the school looks for sometimes for a graduate program, even better, because graduate programs, I think, are more similar to a professional job in the sense that in the description, they have a lot of times description of the program, what kind of students maybe they look for, etc. And in that description are probably some keywords. So some kind of students that they look for or whatever. And so I would look there. If they don't have a description, then there aren't maybe necessarily keywords. Because again, each letter is unique and is going to be very different from the other letter that for some other student. But I would definitely look in the descriptions of the program. But yeah, so back to the exercise. What I like for you guys to do, I'll give you guys 3 minutes just for the sake of time. I just want you guys to really quickly kind of read through this and tell me, do you think it's a strong letter or not? And what is if it is a strong letter, why is it strong in one sentence? And if it's a weak letter, why is it a weak letter? The first thing I notice about this letter is it's short. Obviously, your letter doesn't need to be 1,000 pages, but this is really short for a letter. This doesn't even like these are like 3 paragraphs, and even these paragraphs are 2 sentences. And that's an issue because it probably A, doesn't include examples, so it's not concrete. And as you guys probably just saw, this doesn't include examples. It doesn't include a project, it doesn't include a task. It doesn't really say much. This was their 11th grade math teacher, and they made a very blanket statement of he was a strong student, he worked well with others, and impressed me with his consistent effort. Well, why? How did you conclude that he's a strong student? How did you conclude how he worked well with others? For example, worked well with others, that's so easy to do the show and not tell. How do you do that? Well, I say, oh, well, this student, I assigned a group project and I saw how he interacted with his group mates. And he took a leadership role by assigning the different tasks to make sure that everybody was doing what they were best at. And it resulted in a really successful project that I now use as an example for others to look at. Something like that, you know? And so that's something to think about is you're not going to see the final letter, unfortunately, but if you understand what a strong, standard, good letter looks like, then it helps you when you're discussing with the individual, maybe some things that you want to be included. Somebody said social activity. Yes, they included that. But remember what I said about the trap of not just basically relisting your resume. We don't want that. We don't want them just to say, okay, yeah. And even though it's on his resume, I just want to say it again. He took part in Amnesty International Club and he also contributed to the school newspaper. It's basically just an afterthought, you know? They just said, oh, I don't have anything else to say, so let me just throw this on there. So overall, I would say this is a very weak letter, both in length and in content. So this is like the letter you absolutely do not want. This is your worst nightmare. So just something to think about. So here's the second example. Actually, I will say that this, while lengthwise, so last one it was short, this one is a little bit longer, which is good. I would still say this is a weak letter. And maybe that's shocking to you guys, but the reason I say that is again, so this is an AP biology teacher who's writing this letter. Everything else included in here is something that's basically from the student's resume. So you mentioned, for example, you said the class treasurer. That's great to include, but everything in here only talks about what is on a resume and not about the interactions with the professor and the student. And so she hasn't included any examples of when the student was working in her class, what did he or she show her? What did they do? What were some things that stood out? You know, all of these things are things I'm going to have on my resume. And so they have basically just recited the entire resume. So they talk about in that second paragraph, which is good that they talk about it, but they talk about just the class treasurer. Then they talk about some awards they got. Okay. And then they kind of conclude and say, I recommend them. All of these things, class treasurer, hospital volunteer, literacy coach, those are all different things that they did, not with this professor. So the professor only talked about things on their resume, but they haven't talked about their specific interaction and how they got to know the student. And that is more important. And so remember what I said was one of the biggest traps, and this is so easy to fall into, is you get somebody who just rewrites your resume, and you do not want that. You do absolutely do not want that, because especially for some of you who are applying to the graduate programs, because you're going to include your resume most likely, and they're going to see that and they're going to think, okay, this person literally just rewrote their resume just in a different format, and it doesn't help us decide if they're a good candidate or not. And so remember that. All right, let's go to the final example. This one, it's not even the whole letter. I couldn't actually cut it off. I had to, because for the sake of this presentation, I could only fit so much into this small little screen. But take a moment just to even read just the first paragraph. A bias in this case is good because you're not going to choose somebody who's going to write you a bad letter, right? And so the person is going to write good things about you. And so when somebody writes good things about you, they're going to already seem biased. But yeah, so they're going to seem biased no matter what. But that's a good thing because they like you and they're going to write why they like you. And because they like you, they're also writing you a letter. So there already is a bit of biasm in it, but that's not something to be scared about. A personal letter is really good because it shows that you have a strong relationship with the person. So don't really worry about if something's too personal. I think in a lot of times that's not something to be fearful of. So I see some people said it's strong. Some people said that they don't see examples though. I didn't actually get to include the whole letter, like I said, but the first paragraph, as someone mentioned, is kind of still that very general paragraph. But that's okay because it's the introduction paragraph. But when you look, for example, she talks about Stacy is perceptive, sharp, quick individual with high aptitude for math and science. Well, how do we know this? She goes on to say her final project in class was especially impressive, an investigation of frequency dependent sound absorption. She talks about her project. There's a first example. Let's look at the third paragraph. It says Stacy's the perfect person to get a group project rolling. So she talks about how her from this project and her interaction in robotics clubs and different things. She uses those two examples because she has known her through those two things. She uses those as the basis to really evaluate her and write her letter. Unfortunately, I couldn't include the rest of the letter, but do believe me that the rest of the letter had also even more examples of other interactions. But there are actually examples here, but I know you guys skimmed for the sake of time, so you couldn't obviously get every little detail. But she talks about her project, the robotics club, and she has known her through the robotics club because she advised her in robotics club. So those are two things that she can use to then say that she has high aptitude for something. She's sharp, she's a quick individual, she has really impressive intellectual accomplishments. So she can still include some of her achievements and some things from the resume, but the focus should still be on their interactions and their time spent together. So I hope that kind of makes sense for you guys. So this one is actually a really good one because it's not just talking about resume, it's talking about specific examples, and also it's lengthy. It gives a lot of detail. Obviously, the longer it is, the more detail it includes, hopefully. But make sure that it's not just long, but it also is pertinent and relevant. So it's not just talking about random things like, oh, you like ice cream, or oh, this person likes that. They have to be to the point. Is it okay to ask for a recommendation from a supervisor with whom you have been working 2, 3 months, but it was a short-term internship? Yes, it is for sure. So I'm in my final year of university. I'm getting ready to apply for grad programs, fellowship programs, etc. And one of the recommendation letters I will probably have is from my internship that I did in Washington, D.C. for a semester. And I was only at the internship for, I think, 3.5 months from August until December, the end of August even. So it was what maybe seems as a short-term internship, but still it's enough time for them to get to know you. And if it's a job that maybe relates to the program that you want to do, even better. Then it doesn't really matter that it's short term. So it is definitely okay. And I'd probably recommend it because if it's a recent internship you did, they know you really well, which is good. Overall, the last thing I just kind of want to say, the thing I will just will conclude with, and that I cannot stress enough, is that you are the letter writer's biggest resource. You are the reason that there will be strategy, that there will be a plan, that there will be detail. Without your role in this, you're leaving it all up to them, and that's not necessarily a good thing because then you just have to hope that somebody writes you a good letter, even if they're a really great individual. So really give them all the information, take the time to sit down and discuss with them. And if you want to discuss with them more than once, and if they would like you to look at the letter, that's fine. Although sometimes they request that you waive seeing the final letter, but do take the time to sit down with them at least once. If you do contact only through email, maybe take the time to set up a Zoom call, a Skype call with them, that might also help. Phone call, you name it. But make sure that you are providing them all the information they need. What if some time has passed and a professor may not remember too many details of our interactions? That's normal and that's actually fine. That has happened to me so many times. Like I said, a professor has so many students and they're human. I don't expect you guys to remember everything about what I've said here today because there's so many things to remember and it's not possible all the time. It's the same for people. It's okay to remind them. And that's why, like I said, it's important to give them all as much information as possible. Even remind them, say, I did this project with you, and here was a copy of that project if you still have it. I did this. List all the things that you can help them create examples with. So it is okay if they don't remember, because then you can be there to help them remember. The next question is, if I apply for computer science, can I send a recommendation from my language teacher? I think for undergraduate, you can probably get away with that. For graduate, I would say no, for sure. It needs to be related. But undergraduate, I think overall, if you apply at that point, undergraduate, it's still very general. So a recommendation letter from any kind of professor will help. Even though language doesn't seem necessarily tied to computer science, the skills that you need from in language might not even might, they are applicable to computer science. Analytical ability, ability to evaluate, ability to think critically. Those are all things you need in both. So definitely can use a language teacher as your individual. So that's a good question to ask too. What is the best part of recommendation letter and why is it strong or weak? I mean, what are the parts of it which will for sure surprise admissions committee and leave a good impression? The things that leave the best impression are things that talk about great detail about their interaction personally with you. That is what makes a really strong letter. So those examples that I said, those anecdotes, those little strategically selected stories will do the best job in writing a good letter.